Most philosophers build systems. Diogenes destroyed them. He didn't write treatises. He didn't open a school. He didn't seek patrons or polish his reputation. He lived in a clay jar on the streets of Athens, and from that position, he waged war on everything Greek society held sacred. Wealth, status, reputation, convention. He went after all of it. Diogenes of Sinope, born around 412 BC, exiled from his homeland, and somehow from the margins, he became one of the most dangerous thinkers the ancient world ever produced. Not dangerous because he raised armies, dangerous because he raised questions, the kind that made powerful people uncomfortable, the kind that still make people uncomfortable. See, most thinkers in Athens played the game. They debated in elegant spaces, they courted the elite, they wrapped their ideas in careful, respectable language. Diogenes did none of that. He lived like a beggar. He ate scraps. He mocked generals and philosophers alike to their faces. And he did all of it on purpose. Because for Diogenes, philosophy wasn't a profession. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. It was a way of life, a radical, stripped-down, uncompromising way of life. He argues that truth doesn't live in theories. It lives in action, in how you eat, how you sleep, how you respond to power, how you deal with discomfort. Every single choice, that's where philosophy happens. And that's what made him different from almost everyone who came before or after. He didn't just talk about virtue, he performed it, daily, publicly, relentlessly. He's been called a madman, a fool, a provocateur. But beneath the spectacle, there's a body of thought that cuts deep. Ideas about freedom, about desire, about nature, about what it actually means to live well. Not comfortably, well. So what did Diogenes actually believe? What were the core ideas driving this man who gave up everything and somehow seemed more free than anyone around him? That's what we're going to break down, concept by concept, piece by piece. They called him a dog, and he didn't flinch. Didn't push back, didn't defend himself. He owned it. Diogenes of Sinope, the man who turned an insult into a philosophy. The Greek word for dog is kaion, and from that word comes kynikos, cynic. That's where the whole tradition gets its name. Not from bitterness, not from pessimism, from a dog, from him. But why a dog? What was it about his behavior that made people reach for that particular word? Because Diogenes ate in the marketplace, something no respectable Athenian would do. He slept in a large ceramic jar. He relieved himself in public. He barked at people he considered frauds. He showed affection only to those who deserved it and snarled at everyone else. He lived without shame, without pretense, without a single care for what polite society thought of him. And when people hurled the word dog at him as a slur, Diogenes didn't just accept it, he weaponized it. He argues essentially that dogs possess something most humans have lost, an unfiltered honesty. A dog doesn't perform, doesn't lie, doesn't wear a mask to fit in at a dinner party. A dog knows who feeds it and who kicks it, and it responds accordingly. No politics, no games. Pure, unmediated truth in every interaction. That's what Diogenes saw in the comparison. Not degradation, liberation. He points out, through his actions more than his words, that the so-called civilized life is built on a foundation of lies, manners that mask contempt, flattery that hides ambition, rituals that mean nothing. He strips all of it away. And what's left? A human being living the way an animal lives, openly, directly, without apology. And here's the part most people miss. Diogenes wasn't performing poverty. He wasn't doing this for attention, though attention certainly followed. He genuinely believed that the conventions of Greek society were a cage people walked into willingly, and then decorated, and then defended, and then forgot was a cage at all. He argues that comfort makes cowards, that luxury softens the mind before it softens the body, that the man who needs nothing is the man no one can control, and he lived that argument every single day. So when someone called him a dog, Diogenes would ask, "What's wrong with being a dog?" A dog is loyal to truth. A dog guards what matters and ignores what doesn't. A dog doesn't pretend to be a lion, doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Can you say the same about yourself? That was his challenge, not just to the Athenians, to everyone. He warns that the more layers you put between yourself and reality, wealth, status, reputation, comfort, the further you drift from anything real. The dog lives close to the ground, close to the bone. And Diogenes believed that's exactly where a philosopher should live. Not in a lecture hall, not in a palace, in the dirt, in the street, in the middle of life as it actually is. He didn't build a system. He didn't write treatises. He became the philosophy. The dog wasn't a metaphor. It was a method, a way of cutting through everything artificial and arriving at something raw, something uncomfortably honest. And that discomfort, that's the point. Diogenes argues that if the truth doesn't make you uneasy, you probably haven't found it yet. The dog doesn't care about your comfort. Neither did he. Cynicism, not the modern kind, not that lazy, eye-rolling dismissal of everything. No, the original thing. The philosophy that Diogenes lived, breathed, and weaponized, and it terrified the powerful. The word itself comes from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like, and that wasn't a compliment, it was an insult. The Athenians called Diogenes a dog because he ate in public, slept in the streets, and behaved with zero regard for social decorum. But Diogenes embraces the label. He owns it. Because a dog lives honestly. A dog doesn't pretend. A dog doesn't perform for status. And that's exactly his point. Diogenes argues that civilization itself is a trap, not some parts of it, all of it. The customs, the manners, the hierarchies, the wealth, the reputation, every single thing that society tells you matters. He calls it what it is, artificial, manufactured, a collective hallucination that people mistake for reality. And here's where it gets dangerous. Diogenes doesn't just critique the system from a comfortable distance. He rejects it completely. He strips his life down to nothing. A cloak, a staff, a bowl. And then he throws away the bowl when he sees a child drinking water from cupped hands. Because even that was too much. Even a bowl was an unnecessary attachment. This is what made Cynicism different from every other philosophy of the time. The Stoics talked about virtue. The Epicureans talked about measured pleasure. The Platonists talked about ideal forms. But Diogenes, he didn't talk. He acted. He performed his philosophy in public, in the streets, in front of the very people who held power. And that's what terrified the elite. The wealthy and the powerful in Athens had built their entire identity around status, around property, around public honor. Diogenes walks into their world and says, none of it's real. He doesn't say it politely. He says it with his entire existence. A man who owns nothing, needs nothing, fears nothing, standing right there, in front of them, unmovable. He points out something brutal. The rich are slaves, slaves to their wealth, slaves to their reputation, slaves to the opinion of others. They think they're free because they own things. But Diogenes argues the opposite. Ownership is bondage. The more you have, the more you're chained. And he proves it, not with logic puzzles, not with syllogisms, with his life. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, stands before Diogenes and offers him anything he wants, Diogenes tells him to move out of his sunlight. That's not arrogance. That's a philosophical statement. He's saying, you have nothing I need. Your empire, your armies, your conquests, meaningless. You can't give me what I already have, freedom. That moment shook Alexander, so much so that he reportedly told his men, if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. Let that sit for a moment, because cynicism, as Diogenes practices it, isn't just a philosophy, it's a confrontation. It forces a question that no one in power wants to hear. What if everything you've built your life around is worthless? He warns that society doesn't just distract people from the truth, it actively prevents them from seeing it. The customs, the rituals, the endless accumulation, all of it is noise. And Diogenes' mission, his entire purpose, is to cut through that noise, violently, publicly, without apology. The elite didn't fear Diogenes because he was dangerous in any physical sense. They feared him because he was proof, living, breathing proof that a man could exist without everything they clung to and be freer for it. That's what cynicism was. Not a theory, not a doctrine, a lived demolition of everything society held sacred. Most philosophers wrote books. Diogenes lived his philosophy in the streets, in the marketplace, in full view of anyone willing to watch. And his most provocative tool? Shamelessness. Not recklessness, not vulgarity for the sake of it. Deliberate, calculated, philosophical shamelessness. The Greeks had a word for it, Anaideia, and it wasn't a compliment. In Athenian society, shame was the glue that held everything together. It dictated how you dressed, how you spoke, how you ate, who you associated with. Shame told you what was acceptable, what was civilized, what made you a respectable citizen. And Diogenes looked at all of it, every layer of social expectation, and rejected it, publicly, loudly, without apology. He ate in the marketplace. Sounds trivial now, but in ancient Athens, eating in public was considered degrading. It was something only animals did. Diogenes didn't care. He argues, through his actions, that if a natural need like hunger is nothing to be ashamed of, then satisfying it shouldn't be either. The location doesn't change the act. The body doesn't become indecent just because someone is watching. And he didn't stop there. He reportedly performed every private act, every one, in public. He relieved himself in the open. He was openly sexual in the agora. When people recoiled, when they called him a dog, he didn't flinch. He leaned into it, because that reaction, that disgust, was exactly his point. See, Diogenes wasn't trying to be outrageous. He was running an experiment. He was testing the boundary between nature and convention, and what he found, again and again, is that most of what people call shameful has nothing to do with nature. It's invented, constructed, handed down through custom and repetition until no one questions it anymore. He points out something uncomfortable. Shame is a leash, and most people don't even realize they're wearing it. You don't eat here. You don't say that. You don't dress this way. Why? Not because any natural law forbids it, but because society said so. And society, Diogenes argues, is not a reliable moral authority. It's a machine that produces obedience, not virtue. So Anaideia, shamelessness, becomes a weapon, a tool for exposing the arbitrary. Every time Diogenes violated a social norm and the sky didn't fall, he proved something, that the rule was hollow, that people were obeying out of fear, not reason, that the emperor, quite literally, had no clothes. But here's what's important. Diogenes doesn't argue for chaos. He doesn't say all rules are meaningless. He draws a sharp line between what is natural and what is merely conventional. Nature is the standard. Convention is the distortion. And shame, in most cases, belongs to the world of convention. It protects nothing real. It just enforces conformity. This is what makes his shamelessness philosophical and not just performative. He warns that a life governed by shame is a life governed by other people's opinions. And a life governed by other people's opinions is not a free life. It's a cage dressed up as respectability. Diogenes strips that cage away. He refuses to perform for the crowd. He refuses to modify his behavior based on who's watching. And in doing so, he forces everyone around him to ask the question they've been avoiding. Why do I follow these rules? Is it because they're right? Or is it because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? That question, for Diogenes, is where real philosophy begins, not in lecture halls, not in manuscripts, but in the raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered act of living without shame. One of the most famous acts in the entire history of philosophy, and Diogenes didn't write a single word to earn it. He walks through the streets of Athens, broad daylight, sun blazing overhead, and he's carrying a lit lantern, holding it up to people's faces, one after another, staring at them, searching. Someone asks the obvious question, "What are you doing?" And Diogenes replies, "I am looking for an honest man." That's it. That's the whole scene. But don't mistake its simplicity for shallowness. What Diogenes is doing here is one of the most savage philosophical critiques ever performed. And he does it without writing a treatise, without delivering a lecture. He just walks and looks and lets the absurdity do the work. See, the lantern is the key. He doesn't need it. It's the middle of the day. There's light everywhere. So why carry one? Because Diogenes is making a point, a brutal one. He's saying that even with all the light in the world, even surrounded by people, even in the heart of one of civilization's greatest cities, a genuine human being is almost impossible to find. Not a rich man, not a powerful man, not a famous man, an honest one. And that distinction matters. Diogenes isn't interested in status. He's not measuring people by what they own or what titles they hold. He's measuring them by something far more uncomfortable, whether they're real, whether what they show the world matches what's actually inside them. And his verdict? Almost nobody passes that test. This is Diogenes at his sharpest. He looks at Athenian society, a society that prided itself on philosophy, democracy, culture, and he sees masks everywhere. People performing virtue without possessing it. People chasing reputation instead of truth. People who've built entire lives around appearances. And he refuses to play along. The lantern becomes a mirror. He holds it up, and what it reflects isn't light, it's exposure. He's forcing people to confront a question they'd rather avoid. Are you who you pretend to be? And most people, they weren't. Diogenes argues through this single act that society has made authenticity nearly extinct. People don't even know they're being dishonest anymore. The performance has become so automatic, so deeply embedded, that they've confused the mask for the face. They think they're living truthfully. Diogenes says they're not even close. But here's what makes this more than just a stunt. He doesn't exclude himself from the search. He doesn't claim to have already found what he's looking for. He's still searching. still walking, still holding up the lantern. There's a humility buried inside the provocation, an admission that genuine honesty is rare, maybe even for him. And that's what separates Diogenes from a cynic in the modern sense of the word. He's not just tearing people down for sport. He's pointing at something real, something that actually matters. He's saying, honesty isn't a decoration. It's not something you put on when it's convenient. It's the foundation of what it means to be human. And without it, you're just moving through the world, breathing, eating, talking, but not truly alive. The lantern in daylight, it sounds absurd. It is absurd. And that's exactly why it works. Diogenes understood that sometimes the only way to make people see the truth is to make the truth impossible to ignore. He didn't write it down, he lived it, walked it through the streets, held it up to every face he passed. And the question he asked then, it hasn't been answered yet. Most people spend their entire lives accumulating more money, more property, more status symbols, and they call that progress. Diogenes looks at all of it and calls it slavery. That's not an exaggeration. That's his position. Diogenes argues that the things we own end up owning us. Every possession becomes a chain. Every luxury becomes a dependency. And the more you have to protect, maintain, and worry about. So who's really free? The man in the marble palace losing sleep over his fortune? Or the man in the clay jar who needs nothing from anyone? Diogenes chooses the jar, literally. He lives with almost nothing, a cloak, a bowl, which he eventually throws away after watching a child drink water with his hands, a staff. That's it. And he doesn't do this out of desperation. He does it deliberately, strategically. He strips his life down to the bare minimum because he believes that's where real freedom begins. And here's what makes his position so radical. He isn't saying poverty is noble. He's saying need is the problem. The fewer things you need, the fewer things can be used against you. The fewer things you depend on, the less power the world has over you. Diogenes points out that wealth doesn't make a man strong, it makes him fragile, because the wealthy man's happiness is conditional. It depends on things outside his control. Take away his estate, his gold, his reputation, and watch him collapse. But Diogenes, you can't take anything from a man who has nothing. And that, he argues, is the ultimate form of power. This isn't some abstract theory he's floating from a comfortable distance. He lives it every single day. He sleeps in public spaces. He begs only when necessary. He refuses patronage from the powerful, even Alexander the Great. When the most powerful man in the known world stands before him and offers him anything he desires, Diogenes tells him to move out of his sunlight. That's not rudeness. That's a statement. He's showing, not just telling, that he needs nothing from power, from empire, from wealth. And that moment reveals the core of his anti-materialism. Diogenes argues that freedom isn't something you buy. It's something you subtract your way toward. You don't gain independence by acquiring more. You gain it by needing less. He warns that society has it backwards. People chase wealth thinking it will bring them security. But Diogenes sees wealth as the very thing that destroys security, because now you live in fear of loss. You're not enjoying what you have. You're terrified of losing it. That's not abundance. That's anxiety dressed up in fine robes. So what does true wealth look like to Diogenes? Self-sufficiency, the ability to be content with what nature provides and nothing more. He holds that a man who can eat simple food, sleep on hard ground, endure the cold, that man is untouchable. not because he's suffering, but because he's proven to himself that he doesn't need what everyone else is desperate for. And that proof, that's where his richness lives. Not in coins, not in comfort, but in the absolute, unshakable knowledge that nothing external has a grip on him. Diogenes doesn't reject material things because he hates pleasure. He rejects them because he refuses to let pleasure become a leash. And in that refusal, he finds something most people never will, a life that belongs entirely to him. Before Diogenes became a philosopher, he was a criminal, or at least that's how Sinope saw it. The story goes like this. Diogenes, or his father, or both, depending on the source, was caught defacing the currency in his home city of Sinope, literally altering coins, shaving them down, restamping them, debasing the metal. It was a serious offense. He was exiled for it, cast out, stripped of his citizenship, his standing, his entire former life. And that should have been the end of him, a disgraced man from a minor city, forgotten. But Diogenes doesn't treat his exile as a punishment. He treats it as a beginning. And more than that, he takes the very act that destroyed his social life and turns it into the foundation of his entire philosophy. He argues that what he did to coins in Sinope, every thinking person should do to the values of their society: deface the currency. Not metal currency, moral currency. The customs, conventions, assumptions, and inherited beliefs that people accept without question, Diogenes says they're counterfeit, all of them, and they need to be exposed. That phrase, deface the currency, becomes his mission statement. In Greek, the word for currency is nomisma, and it shares a root with nomos, meaning law, convention, norm. Diogenes exploits that connection deliberately. He's not just talking about money, he's talking about every social contract people live by without ever examining it. Reputation, status, propriety, honor. He contends that these are the real counterfeit coins, ideas stamped with false value by societies too lazy or too afraid to question them. And he doesn't just argue this, he lives it. Every provocative act, every public scandal, every deliberate violation of social norms, that's Diogenes defacing the currency in real time. He eats in the marketplace, which was considered vulgar. He relieves himself in public. He mocks powerful men to their faces. Each act is calculated. Each one targets a specific convention and asks the same question: why? Why is this considered shameful? Who decided? On what authority? Diogenes holds that most of what people call civilized behavior is just obedience dressed up as virtue. People don't act a certain way because it's good. They act that way because they've been told to, because deviation carries consequences. And that, he argues, isn't morality, it's cowardice. So he defects, completely. He rejects the currency of social approval, and in doing so, he discovers something most people never experience: total freedom. When you stop valuing what society values, society loses its grip on you. It can't reward you, it can't punish you, it can't control you. Diogenes points out that exile, the thing meant to break him, actually liberated him because it forced him outside the system, and once outside, he could finally see it clearly. There's an irony here that Diogenes clearly relishes. The city that expelled him for defacing coins created the very philosopher who would spend his life defacing everything they held sacred. Sinope thought it was removing a problem. It was unleashing one. But Diogenes isn't reckless. He's not defacing values for the thrill of destruction. He argues that you have to tear down the false before you can see the real. Convention buries nature. Society buries instinct. Strip all of that away, and what remains? What's actually worth something?
once every fake coin has been melted down? That's what Diogenes is after. Not chaos, clarity. And it all starts with a crime, a disgrace, an exile. The worst thing that ever happened to him became the only thing that mattered, because Diogenes took the currency of his ruin and minted something entirely new. Most people run from discomfort. Diogenes ran toward it. He rolled in hot sand during summer, embraced cold statues in winter, walked barefoot through snow, ate raw food, slept on hard ground when softer options existed. And none of this was madness. None of it was performance. It was training. Deliberate, calculated, relentless training. The Greeks had a word for it, askesis. We get the word ascetic from it. But for Diogenes, this wasn't about spiritual purity or religious devotion. It was about power, power over the self. He argues that the body is a tyrant if you let it be. It demands warmth, it demands comfort, it demands pleasure. And every time you obey without question, you hand over a piece of your freedom. So Diogenes did the opposite. He denied the body what it craved, not to destroy it, but to master it, to teach it who's in charge. And this is where he separates himself from ordinary thinkers. Most philosophers talked about virtue. Diogenes trained for it, the way an athlete trains for competition. Repetition, endurance, pain. He treats philosophy not as a subject you study, but as a discipline you practice, with your muscles, your stomach, your skin. He points out something most people would rather not hear. You don't know how strong you are until you've been uncomfortable on purpose. Anyone can be calm when they're fed, warm, and safe, but take those things away, suddenly you see what a person is actually made of. Diogenes wanted to know what he was made of every day, so he tested himself every day. And the suffering wasn't the goal. That's a critical distinction. He wasn't a masochist. He didn't enjoy the pain for its own sake. The goal was the thing that comes after the suffering, indifference. Not emotional numbness, not apathy, a deep, hard-won independence from external conditions. Diogenes argues that once you've voluntarily endured the worst, the world loses its leverage over you. What can anyone threaten you with? Poverty? He already lives in a jar. Hunger? He's already eaten scraps. Cold? He's already slept through frost. You can't intimidate a man who has already made peace with every discomfort you might throw at him. That's the real purpose of asceticism, not punishment, inoculation. He warns that a life built entirely around comfort produces fragile people, people who collapse at the first sign of hardship, people who are enslaved, not by chains, but by their own need for ease. And Diogenes saw that everywhere he looked. Wealthy Athenians terrified of losing their wealth, powerful men paralyzed by the thought of losing their power, all of them prisoners, all of them soft. So he chose the hard path, not because it was noble, because it was necessary. He believed that freedom, real freedom, not the political kind, is something you forge in discomfort. You don't think your way to it, you suffer your way to it. And here's what makes his approach so striking. He didn't ask anyone else to do it first. He didn't preach from a comfortable chair. He went first. Lived it first, bled first. His philosophy wasn't a theory you could argue with. It was a life you had to confront. Diogenes argues that the unexamined life isn't worth living, but he goes further. The untested life isn't worth trusting. You can believe you're strong. You can tell yourself you're free. But until you've sat in the cold by choice, with nothing, needing nothing, you're just guessing. Askesis skirts the guesswork away.
What remains is either real, or it was never there at all. Diogenes had many targets, but none more persistent and none more personal than Plato. These two men lived in the same city, walked the same streets, breathed the same Athenian air, but they inhabited entirely different intellectual worlds, and Diogenes made it his mission to tear Plato's world apart, publicly, relentlessly, without mercy. Plato was the philosopher of abstraction, the man of forms. He argues that the physical world is a shadow, a dim, flickering copy of a higher, perfect reality. A chair isn't really a chair. It's a flawed reflection of the ideal chair, existing somewhere beyond human perception. A horse isn't truly a horse. It's an imperfect version of the perfect form of horse. Diogenes hears this, and he's disgusted. Not because it's wrong in some technical, logical sense, but because it's useless. Diogenes argues that Plato has done something deeply dangerous. He's made philosophy irrelevant to actual human life. He's turned the pursuit of wisdom into a parlor game for the privileged, an intellectual performance that changes nothing, challenges no one, and costs the philosopher nothing. And Diogenes refuses to let that stand. The most famous confrontation is the one that still echoes. Plato defines a human being as a featherless biped, 2 legs, no feathers. That's his definition. His students nod along. The academy is satisfied, clean, elegant, rational. So Diogenes plucks a chicken, strips it bare, and here's the thing. He's not just being provocative for the sake of it. He's making a serious philosophical argument. He's exposing the flaw in Plato's entire method. Diogenes points out that reducing reality to abstract definitions strips away everything that actually matters. A definition that can be destroyed by a plucked chicken isn't a definition at all. It's decoration. Plato reportedly adds to his definition afterward with broad, flat nails. But the damage is done, and Diogenes knows it. Because this wasn't a one-time stunt, it was a pattern. Plato lectures about the forms, Diogenes interrupts. Plato discusses the ideal table. Diogenes holds up an actual table and asks where the tableness is. Plato retreats into abstraction. Diogenes drags him back to the concrete, the physical, the real. He argues that Plato's philosophy is a luxury, something only a man with wealth, leisure, and social standing could afford to attain. A poor man doesn't care about the form of justice. He cares about whether he'll eat tonight. And Diogenes insists, any philosophy that can't speak to that man is no philosophy at all. But there's something deeper here, something beyond intellectual rivalry. Diogenes sees in Plato a kind of cowardice. Plato builds systems, grand, beautiful, internally consistent systems, but he never puts himself on the line. He never lives his philosophy in a way that costs him anything. He teaches in a comfortable academy, surrounded by admiring students, funded by powerful patrons. His philosophy is safe. Diogenes' philosophy is not safe. It costs him everything: comfort, reputation, security. And he argues that's exactly what makes it real. So why did he keep winning? Because Plato fought with concepts. Diogenes fought with reality. Plato could construct an argument that was logically flawless, but Diogenes could destroy it with a single gesture: a plucked chicken, a wooden cup tossed aside. A king sits on a throne. A slave kneels at his feet. The entire world sees a difference. Diogenes doesn't. Not because he's naive, not because he's ignoring the obvious reality of power and chains, but because he's looking at something deeper than social position. He's looking at the condition of the soul. And when you look there, honestly, ruthlessly, the distinction between ruler and ruled starts to collapse. Diogenes argues that the man who calls himself king is more often than not a slave to everything around him, a slave to his appetites, a slave to his luxury, a slave to the fear of losing what he has. He needs his palace, he needs his wine, he needs the constant affirmation of his court. Remove any of it, any single piece, and he falls apart. That's not power, that's dependency wearing a crown. And the slave? The man in physical chains? Diogenes doesn't romanticize his condition, but he makes a brutal distinction. There are chains on the body, and there are chains on the mind. One type is imposed from outside. The other, the more dangerous kind, is self-inflicted, and the man on the throne is wrapped in the second kind so tightly he can't even see it. This is the core of Diogenes' attack on hierarchy. He doesn't engage in political theory, he doesn't propose a new system of governance, he goes straight to the root. He argues that the social categories humans build, king, noble, commoner, slave, are fictions, labels. They describe where you stand in a man-made order. They say nothing about what you actually are. The famous encounter with Alexander the Great captures this perfectly. Here's the most powerful man in the known world, conqueror of nations, commander of armies. He approaches Diogenes and offers him anything he desires, anything. And Diogenes tells him to move. He's blocking the sun. That's not just wit. That's a philosophical demolition. Diogenes is showing in real time who is actually free. Alexander needs conquest. He needs expansion. He needs to be recognized as great. Diogenes needs sunlight, and sunlight is free. He points out that Alexander, for all his power, cannot do what Diogenes does. He cannot sit still, he cannot want nothing, he cannot stop. Alexander is driven by ambition, by ego, by a hunger that no amount of territory will ever satisfy. And a man who cannot stop is not a man in control. He's a man being controlled. So who's the king? And who's the slave? Diogenes flips the entire framework. He argues that true authority is not over others, it's over yourself, mastery of your own desires, independence from external conditions. The man who needs nothing from the world is the man the world cannot touch. And that man, whether he lives in a palace or a ceramic jar on the street, is the only one who's truly sovereign. This wasn't abstract theorizing. Diogenes lived it. He owned almost nothing. He depended on almost no one. And he answered to no authority, political, social, or otherwise. He didn't bow to kings because he didn't recognize their power as real. Their power was contingent, borrowed, built on things that could be taken away. His freedom couldn't be taken because it wasn't based on anything external. And that, Diogenes warns, is the difference most people refuse to see. They chase rank, they chase status, they climb hierarchies, but every rung they climb ties them tighter to a structure they don't control. The slave changes masters. He never becomes free. Most people chase wealth. Diogenes watched them do it and saw addicts. Not metaphorically, he means it. He argues that the desire for money, for property, for status operates exactly like a dependency. It starts small, a little comfort, a little security, but it grows. It always grows.
Because wealth doesn't satisfy desire, it multiplies it. The man who has one house wants two. The man who has two wants 10. And the man who has 10 lies awake at night, terrified of losing them. Diogenes looks at this cycle and calls it what it is, a trap. He points out that the wealthy man is not free. He's the most enslaved person in the room, chained to his possessions, chained to the opinions of those who envy him, chained to the constant grinding anxiety of maintenance, protecting what he has, acquiring what he doesn't. And he mistakes all of this motion, all of this effort, for a life. But Diogenes sees through it. What looks like ambition is actually panic. What looks like success is actually dependence dressed in fine cloth. So he walks away from all of it, deliberately, completely. He owns a cloak, a staff, a bowl, and even that he throws away when he sees a child drinking water from cupped hands, because the child proved the bowl was unnecessary, and anything unnecessary is for Diogenes a chain. But here's what makes his position so sharp. He's not arguing for poverty as suffering. He's not romanticizing hardship. He argues that the man who needs nothing is the man who has everything. Real wealth in his framework isn't accumulation, it's the absence of need. And the fewer things you need, the closer you are to something most people never taste, actual freedom. And he extends this to status with the same ruthless logic. Titles, honors, reputation. Diogenes treats all of it as smoke. He warns that the man who lives for the approval of others has handed his life to strangers. Every decision filtered through what will they think? Every action performed for an audience. That's not living, that's theater. And the audience doesn't care about you. They care about the show. He proves it by living in total disregard of social expectation. He sleeps in a ceramic jar in the marketplace. He eats scraps. He mocks the rich to their faces. And here's the part that disturbed people then and still disturbs people now. He's not miserable. He's not suffering. He's laughing. He's freer than any man in Athens, and everyone can see it. And that visibility is the provocation. Because Diogenes doesn't just reject wealth, he exposes what wealth really costs. He argues that every luxury comes with a leash. Every comfort tightens a dependency. And the more you accumulate, the more fragile your life becomes. Strip away a rich man's estate and watch him fall apart. That's the difference, and he wants you to see it. Not so you'll throw away your possessions tomorrow, but so you'll stop pretending they make you free. They don't. They never did. The man who owns nothing and needs nothing, he's the one nobody can touch. Here's a question most people never bother to ask. Why are you ashamed? Not what are you ashamed of, why? Where did that feeling come from? Who put it there? And more importantly, who does it serve? Diogenes asks these questions, and his answer is devastating. He argues that shame is not natural, it's installed. Society plants it in you early, through customs, through norms, through the quiet pressure of other people's eyes. And once it's in you, it does its work beautifully. You police yourself. You shrink yourself. You stop doing what's natural and start performing what's acceptable. And you call that civilized behavior. Diogenes calls it a cage. This is why he lives the way he does. He eats in the marketplace, something considered deeply improper in Athens. He relieves himself in public. He says exactly what he thinks to anyone, regardless of their rank. And yes, he does things in the open that would make most people look away. Not because he's unhinged, but because he's making a point. A sharp, deliberate, uncomfortable point. If an act isn't wrong in private,
Diogenes asks, why is it wrong in public? What changes? The act itself? No, only the audience. So the shame isn't about the thing, it's about being seen. And that means the shame has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with perception, with reputation, with fear of judgment. And Diogenes refuses to live under that fear. He holds that true freedom, not political freedom, not financial freedom, but real, bone-deep freedom, starts the moment you stop caring what others think of you. Not in a reckless way, in a philosophical way. He's not saying be cruel or careless. He's saying stop letting the opinions of strangers dictate how you move through the world. Because the moment you do that, you've handed your autonomy to people who don't even know you. And most people hand it over willingly, gladly, every single day. Diogenes sees this everywhere. He sees men chasing honor, bending themselves into shapes that please the crowd, saying what's expected instead of what's true. And he warns that this is the deepest form of bondage, because the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. He thinks he's choosing, but he's just obeying norms he never questioned, following rules he never agreed to. So Diogenes breaks them, publicly, loudly. Not for shock, for demonstration. Every scandalous act is a lesson. Every broken taboo is a mirror held up to society, forcing it to confront the absurdity of its own conventions. He's not performing chaos. He's performing philosophy with his body, with his behavior, with his entire existence. And the reaction he gets, that proves his point. The anger, the disgust, the outrage, none of it is rational. It's reflexive. It's programmed. People aren't thinking when they react to Diogenes. They're obeying the shame that was put inside them before they were old enough to resist it. He argues that a truly free man is one who has burned that programming to the ground, who acts according to nature, not according to custom, who measures his behavior by reason, not by reputation. That's what zero shame looks like in Diogenes' philosophy. Not the absence of morality, the absence of pretense. Not doing whatever you want without consequence, but refusing to let artificial consequences control what you do. Diogenes doesn't reject shame because he lacks self-awareness. He rejects it because he has too much of it. He sees what shame really is, a tool of control, and he will not be controlled. Plato once called Diogenes a Socrates gone mad, and that line, that one throwaway remark, tells you everything you need to know about what Diogenes was doing, and what he was doing terrified the philosophers of Athens. See, Socrates asked questions. He cornered people in the marketplace, dismantled their assumptions, forced them to confront how little they actually knew. That was revolutionary. But here's the thing, Socrates still played the game. He still attended banquets, still engaged with the powerful on their terms. He questioned the system from within the system. Diogenes looked at that and said, not enough. He didn't just question convention. He rejected it entirely, publicly, without apology. Where Socrates used dialogue, Diogenes used his entire life as the argument. Every single thing he did, sleeping in a clay jar in the marketplace, eating with his hands, relieving himself in public, was philosophy in action. Not theory, action. And that's what makes cynicism, real cynicism, not the watered-down modern version, so radical. The word itself comes from the Greek kainikos, dog-like, because that's what people called Diogenes, a dog. He owned nothing, he lived on the streets, he answered to no one, and he wore that insult like armor. But don't mistake this for rebellion without substance. This wasn't a man throwing a tantrum at society. Diogenes argues something far more dangerous, but everything people chase, wealth, status, reputation, political power, is artificial, constructed, meaningless. He holds that civilization itself is a kind of sickness, a web of agreements people collectively uphold so they don't have to face what they actually are: animals, creatures, beings who need food, water, shelter, and nothing more. That's the core of Cynic philosophy as Diogenes practices it. Strip everything away. Every luxury, every comfort, every social expectation. And what's left? That's where freedom lives. Not in accumulation, in reduction. Socrates pointed at illusions and named them. Diogenes went further. He refused to participate in them at all. And that's why Plato's insult is actually the highest compliment. Socrates gone mad means Socrates without compromise, Socrates without politeness, Socrates taken to his logical, terrifying conclusion. And Athens didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't building a school. He wasn't writing treatises. He wasn't gathering disciples in some quiet garden to debate the nature of the forms. Diogenes argues that philosophy isn't something you study, it's something you live. Every breath, every meal, every interaction. Either your life is your philosophy, or your philosophy is worthless. That's what separates him from every thinker before him. Socrates made people uncomfortable with questions. Diogenes made people uncomfortable with his existence. He was a living, breathing indictment of everything Greek society held sacred, and he did it deliberately. The birth of true cynicism, then, isn't a date on a timeline. It's a rupture, a violent break from the idea that philosophy belongs in lecture halls and symposiums. Diogenes drags it into the dirt, into the streets, into the raw, ugly, undecorated reality of human life. And that's precisely why it endures. Not because he wrote great works, he didn't. Not because he built institutions, he refused to. It endures because Diogenes demonstrates something no amount of elegant argumentation ever could, that a human being can live with almost nothing and still be free, still be whole, still be, in some strange and deeply unsettling way, more honest than everyone around him. Plato had his academy. Aristotle had his lyceum. Diogenes had a clay jar and a sharp tongue. And 24 centuries later, we're still talking about him. That tells you something. There's a moment in history that never loses its edge. Alexander the Great, conqueror of nations, commander of armies, the most powerful man alive, walks up to a man lying in the dirt, a beggar, a philosopher, Diogenes of Sinope. Alexander, surrounded by his entourage, looks down and asks a simple question: "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes, without standing, without flinching, without a shred of reverence, says, "Yes, get out of my sunlight." That's it. That's the whole exchange. But don't mistake brevity for simplicity. What Diogenes does in that single sentence is dismantle an entire worldview. He strips Alexander, the king, the legend, the so-called great, of every layer of prestige, and he does it not with a sword, not with an army, with indifference. See, Diogenes argues something radical here. He argues that Alexander has nothing to offer him. Nothing. Not wealth, not land, not protection, not status. The most powerful man on the planet stands before him, and Diogenes treats him like an obstruction, a shadow, something between him and the sun. And that's the point. Diogenes holds that true freedom doesn't come from accumulating power over others. It comes from needing nothing from them. Alexander commands empires, but he's enslaved to ambition, to conquest, to the endless hunger for more. Diogenes owns nothing, and yet he's the one who's free. He doesn't need Alexander's approval. He doesn't need his gifts. He doesn't even need his attention. So who really is the powerful one? That's the question Diogenes forces into the open, and it's deeply uncomfortable because we're trained to admire the Alexanders of the world, the conquerors, the empire builders, the ones with titles and thrones. But Diogenes flips that hierarchy on its head. He suggests that the man who needs nothing holds more power than the man who has everything. Alexander himself reportedly understood this. There's an account, whether legendary or literal doesn't matter, where Alexander turns to his companions afterward and says, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Even the conqueror recognized it. Even he saw that Diogenes had something he didn't, something his armies couldn't take, something his empire couldn't buy: peace, autonomy, completeness within himself. Diogenes doesn't preach this in a lecture hall. He performs it. He lives it in real time, under the open sky, in front of the most intimidating man in the known world. And he doesn't blink. That's what makes this moment so sharp. It's not theory, it's demonstration. He warns through his very posture that authority only has power over those who recognize it. Refuse to recognize it, and it collapses. Alexander's title means nothing if the person in front of him doesn't care about titles. His wealth means nothing if the person in front of him doesn't want wealth. His power means nothing if the person in front of him has already decided he's free. And that's the real confrontation here. It's not beggar versus king. It's two entirely different definitions of what it means to live well. Alexander believes life is about conquest. Diogenes believes life is about self-possession. One needs the world to kneel, the other doesn't need the world at all. That single line, "Get out of my sunlight," carries all of it. Every bit of Diogenes' philosophy, compressed into 6 words. You don't need what they're selling. You never did. Diogenes doesn't ask you to avoid pain. He demands you seek it out. That's the part most people miss. They hear Cynic philosopher. They think of a clever contrarian who lived in a barrel and insulted powerful men. And sure, he did that. But beneath the spectacle was a ruthless philosophical project. Diogenes argues that suffering, voluntary, deliberate, self-imposed suffering, is the only reliable path to virtue. Not education, not contemplation, not debate, suffering. And he means it. See, Diogenes observes something about Diogenes that most thinkers of his era were too polite to say outright. Comfort makes people weak. Not physically weak, though that too, but morally weak. He points out that the moment a person grows accustomed to soft beds, warm meals, and predictable routines, something inside them starts to rot. They become dependent, fragile, enslaved to conditions. And a person enslaved to conditions, Diogenes warns, can never be free, can never be virtuous. Because virtue requires the ability to act rightly regardless of circumstance. And you can't do that if you fall apart the second your comforts are taken away. So what does he do? He strips everything back, sleeps on the ground, eats whatever he can find, walks barefoot through snow. This isn't performance. This isn't some ancient version of a cold plunge trend. Diogenes treats hardship as training. The same way an athlete conditions the body, he conditions the soul. He holds that repeated exposure to discomfort builds something inside a person that no philosophy lecture ever could: resilience. Not the buzzword kind, the real kind. The kind where nothing external has power over you anymore. And here's what makes his position so radical. Diogenes doesn't frame suffering as something to endure on the way to a reward. There's no paradise waiting, no future payoff. He argues that the suffering itself is the point. The act of choosing difficulty when ease is available, that's where virtue lives. That's the exercise. You don't graduate from it, you don't complete it, you do it every single day, or you lose it. He's not being cruel, he's being precise.
Diogenes recognizes that human beings are creatures of habit. Whatever you practice, you become. Practice comfort, you become soft. Practice hardship, you become unbreakable. It's that simple. And he refuses to dress it up in anything more complicated than that. But there's a deeper layer here. Diogenes also contends that comfort doesn't just weaken individuals, it corrupts entire societies. He looks at Athens, at its wealth, its luxuries, its obsession with status and reputation, and he sees a city full of people who've traded their freedom for convenience. They think they're thriving. He argues they're dying, slowly, from the inside, because they've forgotten what it means to need nothing. That's the real war Diogenes is fighting, not against poverty, not against wealth, exactly, against dependency. He warns that the things people cling to for security, possessions, status, pleasure, are the very things that make them vulnerable. The more you need, the more you can lose. And the more you can lose, the more afraid you become. And fear, in Diogenes' framework, is the death of virtue. So he chooses to need nothing, and in needing nothing, he becomes untouchable. It's a brutal philosophy. There's no gentleness in it. But Diogenes never promised gentleness. He promised clarity, and his clarity cuts straight to a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What are you willing to suffer for? And if the answer is nothing, then Diogenes would say you haven't started living yet. When asked where he came from, Diogenes didn't name a city. He didn't say Sinope. He didn't say Athens. He said, "I am a citizen of the world." That answer changed philosophy. See, in ancient Greece, identity was local. You were Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian. Your city-state wasn't just where you lived, it was who you were. It shaped your laws, your gods, your loyalties. Your entire sense of self was wrapped up in the soil beneath your feet. And Diogenes looked at all of that and rejected it. He didn't just leave his city, he left the entire framework behind. He argues that a person's worth isn't determined by where they were born, what dialect they speak, or which flag they stand under. None of it. A human being is a human being. That's the starting point. That's the only point. And this wasn't some soft, poetic sentiment. This was radical, dangerous even. Because what Diogenes is really saying is that the borders we draw between nations, between peoples, between us and them, are fictions. Useful fictions, maybe, but fictions all the same. He strips citizenship of its power. He strips tribalism of its authority. And what's left? Just the human animal, standing in the open, belonging to nowhere and everywhere at once. He calls himself a cosmopolites, a citizen of the cosmos. And that word, cosmopolitan, which we throw around so casually today, it starts right here, with a man who owned nothing, lived in the streets, and still had the audacity to claim the entire world as his home. But Diogenes isn't making a geographical argument. He's not saying, I want to travel freely. He's making a moral one. He points out that loyalty to a single city, a single tribe, creates blindness. It narrows your ethics. You start caring more about your neighbor's opinion than about justice itself. You follow local customs, not because they're right, but because they're yours. And that, for Diogenes, is a kind of slavery, a leash you can't even see. So he cuts it. He warns that the man who defines himself by his nationality has already surrendered his freedom.
Because now your identity depends on something outside of you, something you didn't choose, something that can be taken away. And Diogenes doesn't build his life on things that can be taken away. There's a sharpness to this idea that most people miss. Cosmopolitanism today gets dressed up in polite language, tolerance, diversity, global citizenship. But Diogenes' version isn't polite, it's confrontational. He's not asking you to appreciate other cultures. He's telling you that your culture, the one you're so proud of, is arbitrary, an accident of birth, nothing more.
And he doesn't stop at nations. He extends this to every category humans use to separate themselves: rich and poor, free and enslaved, Greek and barbarian. Diogenes argues that these distinctions are masks. They hide the one thing all people share: their nature, their raw, unadorned animal nature.
And until you see through those masks, you're not thinking clearly. You're just repeating what you've been told. That's the weight of "I am a citizen of the world." It's not a bumper sticker, it's a demolition. Diogenes tears down every wall that society builds between human beings and dares you to look at what's left. Just people, stripped bare, equal, not by law, but by nature. He wasn't the first to travel, but he was the first to declare that no land owned him and that no border could contain what it means to be human.
Diogenes draws a hard line between two forces that govern human life: Nomos, the laws, customs, conventions that society builds, and Physis, nature, what's real, what's raw, what existed before anyone wrote a rulebook. And here's where he gets dangerous.
Diogenes argues that Nomos is not civilization. It's a cage, a set of invisible chains that people wear willingly, proudly even, without ever questioning who put them there. Society tells you what to eat, how to dress, whom to respect, what to chase, and most people just comply. They follow, not because these rules are true, but because they've never stopped long enough to ask whether they are. He sees it everywhere: status, titles,
Wealth, reputation, none of it rooted in nature. All of it manufactured by collective agreement. And Diogenes refuses to agree. This is the core of his rebellion. He doesn't reject society because he's lazy. He doesn't reject it because he can't keep up. He rejects it because he sees it for what it is: an artificial structure that pulls people away from their own nature, away from Physis.
And Physis, for Diogenes, is the only honest guide. Nature doesn't lie. It doesn't perform. It doesn't care about your job title or your family name. It asks one question: what do you actually need? Not what do you want? Not what have you been told to want? What do you need? The answer, he insists, is shockingly little. But society can't function on shockingly little.
Society needs consumers. It needs performers. It needs people who believe that more is better, that status is real, that approval from strangers matters. So it constructs Nomos, layer after layer of expectation, ritual, and obligation to keep people busy, to keep them distracted, to keep them from ever confronting the simplicity of what it means to be human. Diogenes sees this as a kind of mass delusion.
People aren't living. They're acting, playing roles written for them by a culture they never chose. The merchant chases profit not because wealth is natural, but because society told him that's what successful men do. The politician chases power, not because dominance is virtuous, but because the system rewards it. Everyone's performing, and no one's asking, for what? That's the trap. And Diogenes doesn't just talk about it.
He lives against it. He eats simply, sleeps in public, owns nothing. Not as a stunt, as a statement. Every choice he makes is a direct challenge to Nomos, a demonstration that you can strip away every convention society offers and still be whole, still be functional, still be, arguably, more free than the richest man in Athens. He points out something uncomfortable. The more you depend on society's rewards, the more society controls you. Your comfort becomes your leash. Your reputation becomes your prison. You think you're free because you chose the house, the career, the circle of friends, but Diogenes would say you didn't choose any of it. The system chose for you. You just nodded along.
Physis doesn't demand obedience. It demands honesty, and that's precisely why most people avoid it, because living according to nature means confronting yourself without the buffer of social approval, without titles to hide behind, without wealth to cushion the silence. Diogenes argues that real freedom, the kind that can't be taken, bought, or voted away, begins only when a person stops living by Nomos and starts living by Physis, not halfway, fully. And that, for most people, is the terrifying part. Diogenes doesn't ask you to be independent. He demands it. And not the comfortable kind. Not the I have my own apartment and pay my own bills kind. He's talking about something far more radical. A self-sufficiency so complete that nothing external can touch you. No person, no possession, no circumstance. This is the backbone of everything Diogenes stands for. Strip it away, and the rest collapses. He argues that the moment you need something outside yourself to feel whole, you've handed over control. You've made yourself a hostage to money, to reputation, to another person's approval. And hostages don't live freely. They live in constant negotiation, adjusting, performing, compromising, just to keep what they're afraid to lose. Diogenes refuses that arrangement entirely. He doesn't just preach detachment, he lives it. The man sleeps in a clay jar, eats whatever he can find, owns nothing. And here's what's remarkable. He doesn't do this out of despair. He does it out of strategy. Every possession you remove is a chain you break. Every need you eliminate is a fear you destroy. That's his logic. Cold, clean, and deliberate. Most people hear self-sufficiency and think survival. Diogenes means something deeper. He's not talking about growing your own food or living off the grid. He's talking about the architecture of your inner life, the psychological infrastructure. Can you sit alone with nothing, no distraction, no validation, no comfort, and still be at peace? That's his test, and most people fail it. He points out that society is built on manufactured needs. We're trained from birth to depend on institutions, on hierarchies, on the opinions of strangers. And that dependence isn't accidental, it's engineered. Because dependent people are controllable people. They show up, they comply, they don't ask dangerous questions. Diogenes sees through all of it. He calls it what it is, a leash dressed up as civilization.
So, what does true self-sufficiency look like in his framework? It looks like a man who can be insulted and feel nothing, a man who can lose everything and lose nothing. Because everything that matters, his clarity, his will, his freedom, lives inside him, untouchable. But Diogenes goes further. He warns that even emotional dependency is a trap. The need to be loved, the need to be understood, the need to belong. He doesn't deny these impulses exist. He simply argues they make you weak, and weakness, in his world, is the one thing you cannot afford. Not because the world is cruel, though it is, but because weakness robs you of the only thing worth having, autonomy. This is where he separates from almost every other thinker of his time. Plato builds systems.
Aristotle builds categories. Diogenes burns it all down and says, what do you actually need? Not want, not prefer, need. And when you answer that question honestly, the list is terrifyingly short. Air, water, food, shelter from the worst of the elements. Everything else? Decoration, noise, chains you chose to wear. And that terrifying shortness is exactly the point. Diogenes argues that freedom doesn't begin when you acquire enough. It begins when you need almost nothing. The less you need, the less you fear. The less you fear, the more clearly you see. The more clearly you see, the more fully you live. He doesn't promise comfort. He doesn't promise happiness. He promises something harder and more honest than both: sovereignty over your own existence. That's not philosophy as theory. That's philosophy as war.
Diogenes didn't just disagree with the institutions of his time. He attacked them openly, relentlessly, and he did it not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. See, most philosophers in ancient Greece debated ideas in comfortable lecture halls. They wrote treatises, they played nice with the powerful. Diogenes did none of that. He lived in the streets. He carried nothing, and from that position, owning nothing, owing nothing, he looked at the three pillars of Greek society and saw them for what they were: hollow. Start with religion. Diogenes argues that the religious rituals of his day were performance, not devotion. People offered sacrifices to the gods not because they believed, but because they feared, or because they wanted something. He saw prayer as transaction. You give a goat, you get good fortune. That's not faith, that's commerce wearing a mask. And he wasn't subtle about it. He mocked the priests, he ridiculed the ceremonies. He pointed out the absurdity of people begging wooden statues for wisdom they refused to cultivate in themselves. Diogenes holds that if the gods were real, they wouldn't be impressed by burnt offerings. They'd be impressed by how you lived, not what you sacrificed, but what you refused to compromise. That distinction matters. Now, wealth. This is where Diogenes cuts deepest. He argues that wealth doesn't free a person, it imprisons them. The rich man doesn't own his possessions own him. Every object demands maintenance. Every luxury demands protection. Every status symbol demands performance. And so the wealthy man spends his entire life serving the very things he believes serve him. Diogenes watches the rich men of Athens, draped in fine cloth, surrounded by slaves, drowning in comfort. And he sees men in chains, invisible chains, but chains nonetheless. He warns that the pursuit of wealth is a race with no finish line. You acquire one thing, and immediately the hunger shifts to the next, then the next, then the next. There's no satisfaction at the end of that road, only exhaustion. So he rejects it, all of it. He sleeps in a clay jar, he eats what he finds. He owns a cloak, a staff, and a pouch. And he's freer than any senator in Athens. That's his point. Freedom isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you can walk away from. And then there's fame. Diogenes treats the desire for public recognition as perhaps the most dangerous trap of all. He argues that fame turns a person into a puppet. You begin performing for the crowd. You begin shaping your words, your actions, your very identity around what others approve of. And in doing so, you lose yourself entirely. He points out something brutal. The man who craves fame has handed the authorship of his life to strangers. People he's never met now decide his worth. People who don't know him now control his peace. That's not admiration. That's slavery with applause. Diogenes mocks the famous men of Greece, not because he envies them, but because he pities them. They've traded something real for something that vanishes the moment the crowd turns its head, and the crowd always turns its head. So why did he mock religion?
wealth, and fame. Not to be provocative, not to be contrarian. He mocked them because he saw how they sedated people, how they kept people distracted, dependent, desperate. Diogenes argues that you can't live with clarity while chasing things that cloud your vision. Strip it all away. That's where the real work begins. Diogenes watches athletes train. He sees them push through exhaustion, endure pain, restrict their diets, punish their bodies day after day. And he doesn't mock them. He respects the discipline. But he asks a question no one around him seems to be asking. Why does no one train like this for virtue? That question sits at the core of his entire philosophy. He argues that the soul, like the body, can be strengthened, but only through practice, only through repetition, only through deliberate, consistent exposure to difficulty. Diogenes holds that virtue is not a state of mind. It's not an idea you agree with. It's a capacity, a muscle, and like any muscle, it atrophies the moment you stop using it. This is where he separates himself from nearly every other philosopher of his time. Plato theorizes about the good. Aristotle categorizes it. Diogenes trains for it. He doesn't want to understand virtue in the abstract. He wants to possess it in his bones. And the only way to do that, he insists, is through askesis, rigorous, unrelenting self-discipline. Not as punishment, as preparation. Preparation for what? For everything. Diogenes argues that life will test you whether you're ready or not. Loss will come, humiliation will come, pain, betrayal, deprivation. None of it asks permission. And the person who has never trained for those moments will crumble. Not because they're bad, because they're untrained. He draws no distinction between a soldier who collapses in battle because he never conditioned his body, and a person who collapses in crisis because they never conditioned their character. Same failure, same cause. So he trains, constantly. He rolls in hot sand during summer, embraces cold statues in winter, begs for food from people he knows will refuse him. Each act is deliberate. Each one targets a specific weakness: attachment to comfort, fear of rejection, dependence on others' approval. Diogenes treats every humiliation, every discomfort, as a repetition. One more set, one more rep, building something internal that no external force can dismantle. And he's not doing this in isolation. He's doing it publicly, on purpose. Diogenes contends that training in private is incomplete. Real virtue has to hold up under pressure, under the gaze of others, under ridicule. A person who can remain composed only in solitude hasn't actually achieved composure. They've achieved avoidance. Diogenes wants no part of that. He puts himself in the most exposed, most uncomfortable positions imaginable, and he holds steady. That's his proof. Not an argument, a demonstration. But here's what makes his approach genuinely distinctive. Diogenes doesn't separate physical training from moral training. For him, they're the same act. When he endures cold, he's not just toughening his skin, he's practicing indifference to external conditions. When he eats scraps, he's not just surviving, he's rehearsing freedom from desire. The body and the soul train together, or they don't train at all. He rejects the idea that you can think your way to virtue while living in luxury. The body will betray the mind every time. And there's no finish line. Diogenes never claims to have arrived. He never declares himself virtuous and rests. The training is the life. The discipline is the philosophy. He warns that the moment you believe you've mastered yourself is the moment you've lost. Because mastery isn't a destination, it's a practice. Daily, unglamorous, relentless. That's what most people can't accept about Diogenes' framework. It offers no completion, No ceremony, no applause, just the work, day after day. The same question asked every morning. Are you stronger than what the world will throw at you today? And if not, you train until you are. Diogenes didn't sugarcoat anything. Not for kings, not for crowds, not for anyone. The Greeks had a word for this, Parrhesia. It means free speech, but not the way we use that phrase today. Not legal protection, not a right on paper. Parrhesia is something raw. It's the act of saying exactly what you believe to be true, regardless of consequence.
No filters, no diplomacy, no softening the blow. And Diogenes practiced it like no one before or since. He argues that most people live inside a web of polite lies. We flatter the powerful. We tell friends what they want to hear. We bite our tongues at dinner tables and in meeting rooms, and in every space where honesty might cost us something. And Diogenes sees this, all of it, as cowardice. Not social grace, cowardice.
Because here's what he understood. Every time you hold back the truth to protect someone's comfort, you're making a trade. You're exchanging honesty for safety. And that trade, repeated over a lifetime, hollows you out. You become a performer, a diplomat of your own existence, smiling when you don't mean it, agreeing when you don't believe it. And slowly, so slowly you don't even notice, you lose the ability to say what's real. Diogenes refuses that trade completely. When he meets Alexander the Great, arguably the most powerful man alive, Alexander offers him anything he wants. Anything. And Diogenes tells him to step aside. He's blocking the sunlight. That's not a quirky anecdote. That's Parrhesia in action. He points out in a single sentence that power means nothing to a man who already has what he needs. He doesn't bow, he doesn't perform gratitude. He speaks to a king the same way he'd speak to a beggar, because in his eyes, there is no difference. And that's the core of it. Diogenes argues that truth doesn't change depending on who's listening. It doesn't bend for status. It doesn't soften for wealth. A lie told to a king is still a lie, and a truth spoken to a beggar is still the truth. The moment you start adjusting your honesty based on your audience, you've already lost something you can't easily get back. But Parrhesia isn't just about speaking to power, it's about speaking to yourself. Diogenes warns that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others, they're the ones we tell ourselves. The stories we construct to justify our choices, the rationalizations, the quiet agreements we make with mediocrity. He sees self-deception as the deepest form of unfreedom, because you can escape a tyrant, you can leave a city, but you cannot run from a mind that lies to itself. So he strips that away too. He lives in public, eats in public, does everything in public, not for shock, not for spectacle, but because he argues that a man with nothing to hide is a man who cannot be controlled. Secrecy is leverage, and Diogenes gives no one leverage over him. His life is his speech, open, exposed, unedited. And this is where Parrhesia becomes genuinely dangerous. Not because it offends people, though it does, but because it removes the one tool every society depends on to function: compliance. The quiet agreement to go along, to not make a scene, to keep things smooth. Diogenes shatters that agreement every time he opens his mouth. He doesn't do it out of cruelty. He does it because he believes the truth, however harsh, however unwelcome, is the only foundation worth standing on. Everything else is sand. Plato defines man as a featherless biped, a clean, rational, academic definition. The kind of thing that gets nods in a lecture hall. Elegant, tidy, philosophical. Diogenes hears it, plucks a chicken, walks into Plato's academy, holds it up. Behold, a man. That's not a joke. That's a demolition. Diogenes isn't just being disruptive for the sake of it. He's making a precise philosophical point. He argues that Plato's method, this obsession with abstract definitions, with forms, with carving reality into neat intellectual categories, is Hall. It sounds impressive, it wins debates, but it doesn't survive contact with the real world. One plucked chicken and the whole framework collapses. And that's exactly what Diogenes wants people to see. He holds a deep suspicion of academic philosophy. Not because he's anti-intellectual, he's sharper than most of the men he confronts, but because he recognizes something they don't, or won't. That abstraction, taken too far, becomes its own kind of dishonesty. You can define justice in a seminar and still be unjust. You can theorize about the good life and still live a miserable one. Words without practice are empty. And Plato's academy, in Diogenes' eyes, is full of empty words. He sees the academics as men who've mistaken thinking for living. They sit in comfortable rooms, surrounded by students who admire them, debating concepts that never touch the ground. They talk about virtue, but don't practice it. They talk about simplicity, but live in comfort. They talk about truth, but hide behind language so dense that no ordinary person could challenge them. Diogenes challenges them, relentlessly. And his weapon isn't logic, it's exposure. He doesn't write counter-arguments, he doesn't publish treatises. He acts, he performs. He forces a confrontation between what philosophers say and what they do. The plucked chicken isn't a rebuttal in the traditional sense. It's a mirror. He's showing Plato and everyone watching that a definition means nothing if it can't hold up against the simplest test. This is Diogenes' broader war against pretension. He warns that the moment philosophy becomes a performance of intelligence rather than a pursuit of truth, it becomes dangerous. Not because it's wrong in some technical sense, but because it gives people the illusion of understanding without the substance of it. A man who can define virtue in 5 languages but doesn't live virtuously hasn't gained anything. He's lost something. He's traded real wisdom for the appearance of it. And Plato, for all his brilliance, represents exactly that risk in Diogenes' eyes.
There's a reported exchange where Diogenes walks across Plato's expensive carpets and says, "I trample on the pride of Plato." Plato's response, with another kind of pride. Sharp, fair even, but Diogenes wouldn't deny it. His pride is different. It's not built on reputation or intellectual status. It's built on the refusal to pretend, and he'd take that trade any day. He points out that philosophy was never meant to be a career. It was meant to be a way of living. Socrates didn't charge tuition. He walked barefoot through Athens asking questions that made people uncomfortable. Diogenes sees himself as the true heir to that tradition. Not Plato, not the academy. Him, the man with nothing, the man who needs nothing. So when he holds up that plucked chicken, he's not just mocking a bad definition, he's indicting an entire institution. He's saying, you've turned the love of wisdom into a game of words, and I'm here to remind you that wisdom was never about words, it was about how you live. Diogenes doesn't just speak freely, he speaks dangerously, and he does it on purpose. The Greeks had a word for this, Parrhesia. It translates loosely to free speech or bold speech, but that translation is too soft, too modern, too polite. What Diogenes practices isn't free speech the way we understand it, the right to post opinions online without consequence.
His version of Parrhesia is confrontational, it's targeted, it's designed to destabilize. He treats truth like a blade, and he aims it at the people everyone else is afraid to challenge. When Diogenes stands before Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, and tells him to move because he's blocking the sunlight, that's not a quirky anecdote. That's Parrhesia in its purest form.
He's demonstrating that no title, no army, no empire grants a man immunity from truth. Alexander commands nations. Diogenes doesn't flinch, because in his framework, the man who speaks without fear holds more power than the man who rules with force. And that's the core of his argument. Diogenes holds that most people are silenced not by laws, but by consequence. Social consequence, professional consequence. The quiet punishment that comes when you say what everyone knows, but no one will admit. So people self-censor. They soften. They hedge. They speak in careful, measured, diplomatic nothings and call it wisdom. Diogenes calls it cowardice. He argues that a society where no one speaks plainly is a society already rotting. The corruption doesn't start with bad leaders or broken systems. It starts with silence, with the moment someone sees the lie and says nothing. That silence compounds. It becomes culture, and once it becomes culture, it becomes invisible. People don't even realize they've stopped telling the truth because they've forgotten what truth sounds like. Diogenes makes sure they remember. He insults public figures to their faces. He mocks religious rituals in broad daylight. He challenges social customs that everyone accepts without question. And he doesn't do it for attention. He does it because he believes that discomfort is the only path to awareness. Comfort keeps people asleep. A sharp word, the right word, at the right moment, aimed at the right target, wakes them up. But here's what separates Diogenes from a mere provocateur. He's not reckless, he's precise. His targets are never the weak or the vulnerable. They're the powerful, the pretentious, the hypocrites who wear virtue like a costume while living in contradiction.
He goes after philosophers who preach modesty from marble houses, politicians who speak of justice while hoarding wealth. He exposes the gap between what people say and what people do, and he does it publicly, loudly, without apology. He warns that Parrhesia comes at a cost, and it should. Speech that risks nothing means nothing. The value of truth is measured by what you're willing to lose for saying it. Diogenes loses comfort, status, safety, and counts none of it as loss. Because to him, a life lived in strategic silence is not a life at all. It's performance, it's theater, it's slavery with better lighting. This is why Diogenes remains unsettling even now, not because his ideas are strange, but because they expose something we'd rather not face. Most people don't stay quiet because they have nothing to say. They stay quiet because speaking carries a price they're unwilling to pay. Diogenes pays it every single time, without hesitation. And he argues that until you're willing to do the same, you're not free, you're just well-behaved. Diogenes lived over 2,000 years ago. No internet, no corporations, no algorithms. And yet, his diagnosis of human weakness reads like it was written this morning. That should unsettle us. He warned about the tyranny of material excess. He warned about the performance of virtue without substance. He warned about people surrendering their autonomy to systems that profit from their insecurity. Every single warning has aged into prophecy. Think about what Diogenes attacked: wealth hoarding, status obsession, empty ritual, blind obedience to social expectation. Now look around. We live in an era where people measure their worth by follower counts, where success is defined not by inner peace, but by visible consumption.
where entire industries exist to make you feel inadequate so you'll buy the cure they're selling.
Diogenes saw this pattern in Athens. We're living it at global scale. He argues that most people don't actually choose their desires. Their desires are handed to them by culture, by convention, by the pressure to conform. And this is where his philosophy bites hardest in the modern age. Because we've built systems, advertising, social media, consumer culture, that are specifically engineered to manufacture desire, to make you want things you never needed, to make you feel incomplete without them. Diogenes would look at this and see exactly what he saw in ancient Greece: a population asleep, chasing, consuming, never pausing long enough to ask, why? And then there's the performance problem. Diogenes warns that people confuse the appearance of virtue with virtue itself. In his time, it was philosophers who gave eloquent speeches about justice, but lived as hypocrites. In ours, it's corporations posting about values they violate behind closed doors. It's public figures curating an image of authenticity that's anything but authentic. The mask has gotten more sophisticated, but it's still a mask. He strips that away, brutally. Diogenes holds that what you do when no one is watching, that's your character. Everything else is theater. And we've become a civilization that's very, very good at theater. But here's what makes his philosophy genuinely dangerous to the modern order. It can't be bought. It can't be packaged. It can't be turned into a product. Diogenes offers no 5-step framework, no premium membership, no branded merchandise. His entire philosophy resists commercialization because it's built on the rejection of the very impulse that commerce depends on. You can't sell someone freedom from wanting. That's why he's more relevant now than ever. Not because he has comfortable answers, but because he asks the questions no one wants to sit with. Are you living for yourself or for an audience? Do you own your life, or does your lifestyle own you? Are your beliefs yours, or were they installed in you before you were old enough to resist? Diogenes doesn't offer escape from discomfort. He argues that discomfort is the beginning. The moment you feel the friction between who you are and what the world demands you pretend to be, that's the moment philosophy begins. Not in a classroom, not in a book, in that tension. 2,000 years and we still haven't learned what he was teaching. We've just found newer, shinier ways to avoid it. More sophisticated distractions, more elegant cages. Diogenes stands in the middle of all of it, unbothered, unowned, unimpressed. And his challenge remains the same as it always was. Stop performing, stop accumulating, stop outsourcing your identity, and start asking whether the life you're living is actually yours.